the challenges as an instructor is getting students to use our feedback. And when we talk about feedback and think about the value and potential of feedback, one thing is clear. It is a vital, important part of the student online learning experience. Not only does it help them correct errors, give them some one-on-one feedback, help them to really know that they're understanding the material correctly, but it's also one of the best ways to promote students' motivation, their engagement, and really their overall satisfaction with the learning experience. When we surveyed students, and this was just over 5,000 students, and we asked them, in the online learning environment, what do you really think helps your learning? Two things topped the list: feedback and discussions. And if you look at the very top of this graph, what you'll see is students said, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being really important, the most important thing for their learning was detailed feedback on their assignments. And just a couple of notches after that was detailed feedback on discussion forums. And not surprisingly, when we followed to see where good online faculty spend their time, and we defined good as faculty that had good grade distributions, good retention rates, good persistence to the next class, and good success in future classes for which their class was a prerequisite, what we found was good faculty spent the majority of their time on grading and feedback. It's pretty clear. Feedback is important. It's not only important for student learning, but it's important for the entire experience for students learning online. And yet, knowing that the feedback is important doesn't mean that students are actually reading it. Simply put, students can't benefit from things that they don't read. And from the faculty point of view, it's equally frustrating because if we're spending 43% of our time giving feedback and students aren't reading it, that is wasted time. So the purpose of this initial study was really quite simple. We had one driving question. Are students even looking at the feedback that we post in the gradebook? Because even though looking at the feedback does not imply that they're going to use it in a meaningful fashion, we know without a doubt, if they don't look at the feedback, there is no value to that feedback. So for this study, we actually used an analytic that we can get out of our learning management system. And you'll notice in this slide here, there's a little icon with an eyeball. And that just tells us whether or not students looked at the feedback, actually opened up that feedback, and when that happened. And so this was the data point that we really used to dive into that. In addition to that, we actually stepped back and we asked instructors, do you even look at this? Does this matter to you? It's a feedback or a feature in our learning management system, but what are you doing with it? And when we talked to faculty, there were some faculty that told us, I really don't use it. It's not something that I ever look at. And when we dive into that, generally speaking, it was because they didn't really know what to do with that, or they had a philosophy that really that was on the student and that was the student's responsibility. So whether or not the student looked at them was outside of their instructor control. For those faculty that were using it, and the majority of the faculty were using it, they tended to say they looked at it as a way to support struggling students. That when students came to them and said, how can I improve my grade, or I'm not understanding this, what can I do? That they would go into their grade book and they would look at that and they would say, well, maybe let's take a look at your use of the feedback. When are you looking at it? Are you giving yourself adequate time before the next assignment? So really they used it more in a one-on-one fashion to help students understand how they could use the feedback to really improve their learning. But let's dive into the heart of the question. Are students even looking at the feedback? And so the first question we looked at was, are they viewing it at all? And we broke this down by graduate and undergraduate. And the good news is the majority of students are looking at the feedback. At the undergraduate level, 66%, at the graduate level, 77%. So overall, we can say with confidence, a majority of students, and this was a poll of just about 10,000 data points, the majority of students are looking at the feedback. But on the flip side, we also have about 30% that aren't. So even though we can say, yeah, people are looking at it, there's also a fairly substantial portion that are never even clicking it open. And if we dig into this a little bit more, the question becomes, well, maybe they don't need it. Maybe there's something about their learning environment where they're getting the feedback in another format or another way. So we actually broke that down and we looked at online students who do all of their courses online compared to campus students who do all their courses on campus. And then what we have is called the traditional online. These are traditional age students that take some campus courses, but also take some online courses. And what we found was the overall trend didn't shift that much. You still had about 2/3 of the students that were looking at the feedback, about 1/3 that were not, slightly more likely to look at it if they were an online student, but not dramatically so. So then we wondered, well, maybe it's not the mode that they look at the feedback. Maybe it has more to do with the type of student that they are. So we actually divided the students out by their end of course grade. And we split them into high, medium, and low achieving students. So high students ended the course with an A, medium students ended with a B or C, and low performing students ended with a D or an F. And again, the overall percentages didn't change that much. Not all that surprising. The higher achieving students, the ones that we could argue maybe didn't need the feedback as much, they were the ones that were slightly more likely to look at the feedback. But still, regardless of their performance level, it was about 2/3 of the students that were opening the feedback and about 1/3 that weren't. So then we dug a little bit deeper and we said, well, maybe it's not the overall course grade that matters. Maybe it's their grade on that particular assignment. And as you glance at this, again, you'll notice we can almost go with that 2/3 rule again. Interestingly, those that got 100% and got full credit, those in the A students were the most likely to look at their feedback. Students that were the C, D students, they were the least likely, but it wasn't dramatically different. What I actually found interesting was students that did not submit the assignment, so that would be the 0% students. 40% of the students that didn't even submit the assignment did actually look at their feedback. And personally, I found that one interesting because I'm not sure what they were looking for or what they were hoping to gain from feedback on an assignment that they never submitted. Equally interesting, a portion of these assignments, about 1,000 of them, were just no credit assignments. So they were really kind of assignments that if you turned them in, you got credit. If you didn't turn it in, you didn't, but there was no grade differentiation. And students were about equally likely to look there. It was about 56% of the students that opened it up, even if it was not a graded assignment. And so just trying to kind of piece this apart and see if we could pull out any nuances of this, we wondered if the rate of viewing their grades changed across the term. Perhaps there was some patterns that students became more or less likely to look at their feedback as the semester went on. And these are actually accelerated terms, so these are 8-week terms. And what we found was not really. You see a slight drop off as they approach week 7 and 8, but I would argue that that's less about not looking at their feedback and more about the fact that they're moving on and the feedback happened as the course was ending. So we'd need to dive into that one a little bit more to see, but generally speaking, we were still seeing about that rate of 2/3 looking at the feedback and about 1/3 that weren't. We also looked just to see like how long after the instructor posts the feedback does it take before a student looks at it. And this was the area that really there was no clear-cut patterns at all. On average, it was about 2.5 days, but this literally ranged anything from immediately, right away looking, all the way up to, months after the fact that they were logging in to take a look. The standard deviation was very large, which just tells us that there's not a lot of clear-cut patterns in how quickly students go to seek out that feedback. Likewise, we wonder if that delay changed as the term went on, and we did find that they were a little faster at checking their feedback as the semester ended. But again, I don't know that this is that surprising when you consider that most of them would want to see those last pieces of feedback before that course ends and they move on to the next course in the sequence. So, as we look at the general patterns across all the data, about 2/3 are viewing the feedback. And on the upside, that's not bad. On the flip side, though, this means we have about 1/3 of our students that are never even opening the feedback to have any potential from gaining from that feedback that we're providing. And so as we think about this as instructors, our next study is really going to be diving in to see, what can we do? Are there instructional strategies we can put in place to increase the likelihood at which students will at least open the feedback, recognizing that opening it alone doesn't necessarily tell us they're using it, but failing to open it definitely tells us that they're not. And so there's kind of 3 buckets you can look at here. One thing we need to do as instructors is probably just increase students' attention to the fact that the feedback is there and ready. But we also need to think about how do we support faculty to really be efficient in their feedback, recognizing that 1/3 of that feedback isn't being read at the moment. And so that's really 1/3 of wasted time. So if we can make it more efficient to give feedback, we can potentially continue giving feedback while we're trying to increase that percentage of students that's accessing it. Likewise, even as an institution, we should look at what are the policies regarding feedback and how that really faculty are supported and guided in their use of feedback so that we can be really targeted in supporting our students. In terms of increasing students' attention to feedback, there's a lot of things we could possibly do. And again, we're currently starting to dive in to see if any of these specific strategies would help. For example, if we do video or audio feedback, are students more likely to look at it? If the assignments are specifically scaffolded to utilize the feedback and the assignments require them to use the feedback, will that increase it? Perhaps it would even increase it if we started doing more targeted feedback where we tell students, this is an assignment that the feedback is important, be sure you look at it, versus other assignments where maybe we say, we're not going to give as much feedback on this one, maybe something like a discussion thread, because that feedback is provided in the classroom. There's lots of potential things we can start doing, and this is what the next presentation, give me a year or so, and we'll take a look and tell you which of these had the greatest impact on increasing students opening and looking at that feedback. Likewise, we just need to think about how to support faculty. If we go back to the idea that 43% of our time in the online classroom is spent providing feedback, we should probably support faculty in doing that. Whether that's in providing increased resources by giving them feedback banks or maybe course guides that have some standard feedback or some exemplars that they can use to reduce the need for feedback, or whether that's something we do in online course design itself via the use of rubrics or increasing the student support so that we decrease the need for really one-on-one feedback, or possibly it's even in faculty training, giving faculty more background on what are these alternate modes of feedback, how could they use feed forward, how could they use text expanders, and what are some different strategies just to be more efficient in the delivery of that feedback. And then as a last level, just thinking more institutional level. Maybe as an institution, we do vary our expectations. Maybe feedback is really more about the value or role of that assignment within the curriculum, and we make that really clear to students that this is a targeted assignment and that other assignments perhaps are not going to have individualized feedback. Or using early alert systems, other institutional resources, bringing in the idea of corrective or peer-reviewed feedback really as part of the curriculum itself and as part of the expectations for our faculty. As you can tell by this presentation, this is just the beginning. We can't talk about how to help students effectively use feedback if we can't start by being sure they're even looking at it. And so I'd be happy to continue the conversation, and I'll be back at some point in the future to let you know on what we find on strategies to really help increase those usage rates.